I'm delighted to open this event tonight with Ambassador Kai Eide and Ambassador Zahir Tanin. Before introducing them, I want to just mention Scott Smith. I should say Professor Scott Smith, since he is now in a new career teaching at Columbia University. I mean, he was instrumental in putting that event together, and he was a very trusted and valuable aide of Kai, and it shows that the UN does many things wrong, but sometimes it recruits the right people, and that was one of the examples, one of the exceptions. I hope not an exception. Tonight we are very privileged in the Saltzman Ambassadors series to have two exceptional diplomats with us. You have seen their biographies, and I'm not going to go through their bios again. I would just want to say that, and I have known Ambassador Zahir Tanin since he joined the United Nations as the permanent representative of Afghanistan to the United Nations, and he has been the ambassador of Afghanistan at a critical time for his country, and has made an enormous impact in the United Nations, representing with immense distinction his country. And I would add, among his many activities, that because of the consideration that he inspires in the UN, he has been given an impossible task as the chair of the intergovernmental negotiations on Security Council reform. That's probably one of the most impossible tasks that one can have, but I think it's a tribute to the respect he enjoys in the UN, that he has been in that position now for several years, and I think if someone was in a position to really move that most difficult of issues forward, that's him, and we should have him back at Columbia to discuss that someday. I have known Kai Eide also at the United Nations. Kai Eide has occupied some of the top diplomatic positions in the Norwegian diplomatic service. Before I myself was at the UN, he had been a special representative of the Secretary General in Bosnia. I did not know him at the time because I was not at the UN at the time, but his reputation was there, and so I was very pleased when he accepted to work on the Kosovo file. And this was one of the most difficult issues at the UN, with a deeply divided Security Council, with a very difficult situation in the ground, and he's certainly the person who helped, in a way, start the process of negotiation. And he was successul in starting that process, in getting that process started, because he has two qualities which are essential in any difficult situation. That is courage and finesse, and he showed that. He showed that on the Kosovo file, and he was going to show it again on the Afghanistan file that we are going to discuss tonight. The job of a special representative is a very difficult job because we don't live in colonial times, as you remind us in your book. And so to be a successful special representative, you need that combination of respect, humility, finesse, and at the same time courage, because it's easy to be accepted if you say nothing. But the challenge of the job is to be neither a bully nor a pushover, and to speak truth to power, but to do it in a respectful way, and with the deep awareness that this is not your country, this is a country that you have come to help, and that you will not suffer the consequences, so to speak, of your advice. Kai, for that reason, was the ideal person to go to Afghanistan. Without further ado, I'm going to ask him to speak about the book that has just been published in English, that was published in Norway about a year ago. I got the book only yesterday, but I can tell you I was up until past midnight because I definitely wanted to read it in full before the meeting, and it was not hard to stay up past midnight because it's an extraordinary, interesting book which will give you both food for thought on a lot of issues, I mean, that sometimes go beyond Afghanistan, and at the same time a very honest and fair account of the challenges of the international community in Afghanistan, with an interesting gallery of characters, and not least President Karzai himself. And so I think it's really a must-reading, not only for people who are interested in Afghanistan, but I would say for everybody who is interested in that difficult business of how one can help a country recovering from conflict. So over to you, Kai, and then Ambassador Tanin will bring the Afghan perspective to our discussion. Thank you. You, as you wish, you can.
Thank you very much, Jean-Marie, and it's a pleasure to be here with you and with Ambassador Tanin, and also with Scott and Crispin and Joanna, who worked with us in Kabul. It's a pleasure to see old faces again, and also the rest of you, of course. Pleasure to be here. When I was in Kabul, the most challenging, I think, event that we had was the presidential elections, where I happened to be accused of trying to hide about 500,000 votes or so, fraudulent votes. And this kind of reputation lives with you, you know. You come back home to your own little village outside of Oslo. My wife says to me one day, "Could you take the cat to the veterinarian because he has to clean his teeth?" I said, "Well, all right, and I'll fetch him in the afternoon." So I do. I go there with the cat, and I come back in the afternoon, and I ask the veterinarian, "How much does this cost?" And he said, $300. I said, $300 to clean the teeth of a cat? That's pretty much. Yes, but I castrated him also. The veterinarian said, and I said, "Castrated him?" There was no agreement around the table yesterday to castrate the cat. There was a discussion, yes, but no agreement. So the veterinarian said, "So you have election fraud at home also?" So there are certain things that you never can get rid of. I guess I started in Kabul in a little different way from many SRSGs. Because I was there on the 14th of January in 2008. There was an attack on the Serena Hotel. I was the only one from the Norwegian delegation who managed to get away, in fact, 20 seconds before the bomb blast, on my way to the presidential palace. So I was lucky. And the next day we had lunch with President Karzai, and our foreign minister asked the question, which was relevant and very much on everybody's mind at the time. "Now, how are things going with regard to the recruitment of the next UN envoy?" And Karzai looks at our foreign minister and points at me and says, "I want him." And I was shocked, and our foreign minister was shocked, and the foreign minister said, "What do you want me to say?" And I said, "Talk about something else. Talk about something else. Just forget it." But then eventually it happened that way. And I remember when I first came into Karzai for my first meeting with him, he looked at me and he opened his arms and he said, "God has his way, Mr. Eide, God has his way." So at least I was welcomed. And it's good to come in that way, not only to be appointed, and not only, I didn't mean that, but to be appointed by the Security Council upon recommendation of the Secretary General, but in fact, you knowing that the President of the country really wants you there. So I was very happy about that, and I think it was a good starting point. It reflected also much of my thinking about how to address an issue like the one we were facing in Afghanistan, which is, as Jean-Marie said, you have to be a guest. You have to behave as a guest. The Afghans, you will not find anybody more hospitable as long as you are within the limits of the role of a guest. But once you cross the line between guest and intruder, then you are in a different situation. So I think showing respect for a country's religion, culture, traditions, is utterly important when you embark on a job like that. It was also at a time where the international community was a little bit in a disarray, had been working more or less, I think, without a strategy for years. The only strategy was to do more of the same, hoping that more of the same would help, more military forces, more money, without really setting a strategy for what you use the military forces and the money for. And therefore, money was spent on absolutely everything without any kind of clear priority. And I remember the first meeting I had in Bucharest with the ISAF heads of state and government in April 2008, where I was frightened to see that in the short communique of 2 pages, President Karzai was mentioned once, Ban Ki-moon once, and I was mentioned twice. And I thought, I'm in for trouble. And I was, because the expectations were there, of course. And why was it like this? I think because the main countries here had been involved in the Afghan conflict for then 7 years and needed to see results and did not have a clear strategy and hoped that together we could shape one. And there were certain key words or buzzwords at that time. One was comprehensive concept. We had to shape a comprehensive concept where military and civilian could work together. And we also had to have a better coordination of the civilian aid. And Tom Gregg is here, not here today, was my political assistant before Scott came in. And I remember I was asked at a meeting of ambassadors here in New York, Mr. Eide, how fast do you think you can manage to improve the coordination of civilian assistance? And I said carelessly, well, in a few months' time, I guess we should be able to make progress. I got down on the 2nd Avenue again, the 3rd Avenue where the Canadian delegation is. And Tom looks at me and said, never say such a thing again. Never say it. It's going to take much longer and be much more difficult than you can ever imagine. And it was much more difficult. But these 2 issues, civil-military coordination, cooperation, and the civilian aid effectiveness and donor coordination were the 2 main issues. And then they wanted somebody in the international community to be in charge of it. On the Afghan side, there was another priority that I encountered already from the outset with the meeting with the President Karzai and also with the ministers, which was, we need to be more in charge now. You cannot sit there as a UN representative or a US ambassador and be in charge. It has to now be given to the Afghans. We can't be in a situation anymore where every time an ambassador or a minister comes, we hear a different message. You have to coordinate with us and under our leadership. And I think that was certainly the right approach. Much had been spoken about Afghanization already, but very, very little had been done in order to help the Afghans take charge of their own future. Now, what did it look like? Let me go through some of these elements briefly on the civil, on the donor effectiveness and aid coordination side. Well, first of all, I must say, if you looked at what had been given to Afghanistan compared to other countries, the first year after the fall of the Taliban, 1/16 of what was given to Bosnia-Herzegovina had been invested in Afghanistan. 1/16, not a huge amount of money. Karzai was already traveling around to the big capitals trying to mobilize support, financial support, but without much success during the first period. And he had been through that kind of effort before, during the Taliban period. But there was little investment in governance, at least little efficient investment in governance. And what did that mean? It meant that President Karzai, when he came in December 2001, was not given the support he needed to do one critical thing, which was to build the civilian institutions through which he could project power in the country. He was not given that. On the contrary, those who had the real power, I dare to say, Ambassador, was the old warlords who had worked with the Americans in throwing the Taliban and Al-Qaeda out. President Karzai came in without any instrument other than the support from the Bonn Conference, of course, and from the big powers. He was a tremendous handicap. And when we later talk about him as the mayor of Kabul, I think we should take a certain self-criticism for the fact that he ended up in that situation. So the technical assistance also was uncoordinated. I remember myself going to ministries, meeting people who had $500,000 in salary, $500,000, funded by big donors, international donors, and in the office next to them were Afghans having $1,500 or $2,000 in annual salary. That is not a situation that encourages and creates a good morale inside a bureaucracy that is being developed. And then, furthermore, most of the resources were focused in the south and the east of the country, in the conflict provinces. And what was the situation there? There was a conflict. And of course, the investments had very little impact. Very little impact. What was built could be destroyed easily. And the big countries who were there, of course, invested mostly in small hearts and mines projects that did not have any impact in the terrain and did not turn the Afghan people around in favor of the international community. As I said, it was quick impact projects that had low sustainability, which means we would build a building, we could build a school, we could build a hospital, but that would require then Afghan funds or international funds to be able to finance it in the future. And we did not pay any attention, I was saying any attention, to the fact that the Afghans needed income, they needed employment that could allow them to finance all these projects that we put in place. We always have to see to it that when we start something, there has also to be an exit strategy. And the exit strategy must always be on the civilian side to enable the government to pay for what we do. If not, a country becomes more and more dependent on international assistance. And then furthermore, since it was in the south and the east that most of the money was, it was dominated by military structures. It went through military structures because the civilian aid agency did not dare to go outside, go out in the terrain as they would normally do. So it was mostly done by people who had very little development assistance. And as I mentioned, since it went to the south and the east, it did not go where the resources were, where you could really have an impact. The iron ore, the copper, etc., that could be extracted. Afghanistan is potentially a very rich country, but there was no investment in that. And in fact, no investment or little investment in agriculture that they needed. And then came the question, how can the UN in this situation coordinate? It's of course extremely hard, perhaps not to say impossible. There were no structures of coordination, and more important, there was no development strategy. Yes, the Afghans had developed with the international community something called the Afghan National Development Strategy, but it covered absolutely everything from A to Z. And as a result, the Afghan government set up 17 interministerial committees to coordinate. And if you set up 17 ministry committees, then you can be sure there won't be any coordination at all. And that's what happened. Everybody were allowed to continue doing exactly what they had done before. Towards the end of 2008 and early 2009, we managed, I do claim some credit for that, Ambassador, we managed to bring some new and more reform-oriented politicians into the government. And we managed also to start working on a real priority. And we identified 4 priorities. One was agriculture, other infrastructure, then a solid and educational system that covered everything from primary school to universities. And the 4th was governance, that means the building of civilian institutions. That was a set of 4 issues that we believed made sense And we were all very happy when in March 2009 in The Hague a new US administration came in and gave it full support. Finally we thought we have a strategy. There's a breakthrough. And we all rushed back to Kabul, sat down with other ministers and tried to think through what do we do now when it seems that the international community is moving towards a real strategy. But then we were in the middle of an election campaign, an election process that took all the energy and all the attention, absorbed it all, energy that we should have used to be able to concentrate on doing what we had done over the last few months. It was all overtaken by the election. And then, when the election was over, we were in the middle of another debate in the United States, which was how many troops to bring in, when, for what kind of offensives, etc., and for how long should they stay. And from that point, in my view, the US strategy became overly militarized again. And there was no room for the civilian perspectives and the political perspectives that we so desperately needed. And I think that has lasted more or less until now. Let me mention briefly the question of civil-military cooperation, which is so important, but which is seen from two very different perspectives, from the military side and the civilian side. From the military side, and they wanted very much a close civil-military coordination. What did it mean? It meant that the civilian agencies should be behind a military strategy, which I can understand from the military point of view. They had a clear hold-build strategy, as it's called, and to succeed, they needed civilian actors with them. But you could not expect the civilian agencies, NGOs or development agencies, to go with the military into combat situations without arms and become an appendix to a military strategy. You can't expect that. And it didn't happen. Because they all knew that once they moved with the military into a conflict situation, then they, unarmed as they are, would be a target of the insurgency. And their projects would also be seen as part of a winning hearts and minds strategy. And once you're seen as part of that fight, then you are, of course, by the insurgents seen as their opponent, and your projects become legitimate targets. That had to be avoided. And that's why also I ended up in between military and civilian. I remember so well, one day in September 2008, we were in the US mission at NATO, and there was a group of ambassadors around the table, and I was given a hard time because I did not respond as I should to their desire to see greater cooperation, civilian cooperation with the military. And after having had a hard time during that meeting, we went directly to Kabul, where I met some civilian organizations who criticized me for being too close to the military. It was not an easy balancing act to make. And then it was not only a question of what I now said as being the risks of moving in with the military, but there were serious differences in perspective. The short-term perspective of the military in their civilian project, the long-term perspectives of the civilians, and in culture between the chain of command approach of the military and the much more horizontal approach of the civilian community. So it simply was not workable. And our approach became, let us rather see how we can employ our overall resources in the optimal fashion. That means putting the civilian resources where they can have the greatest effect. And I think gradually we managed to turn most around to that, but unfortunately not all, as the militarization of the strategy continued. We had one other big problem with the military civilian cooperation, and that is called civilian casualties. I knew that this was going to be an important point, and I remember the US NATO ambassador at the time when I had my first rounds, her name is Victoria Nuland, not unknown in today's State Department. And she called me into a meeting and said, Kai, we had been colleagues earlier at NATO, we don't want any surprises. No surprises on civilian casualties. And I said, well, look, the human rights is one of the main elements of our mandate. I cannot just put that under the carpet. It's impossible. And I knew that that confrontation would come. And the 22nd of August, 2008, it really came. When an American-Afghan military force attacked a village in the west called Azizabad in Shindan district, which is a huge district in the west of the country. And immediately the military said, no, there were no civilian casualties. There was a bunch of prominent Taliban leaders who had been caught. And gradually, after weeks, they had to admit that there were 37 civilians. We knew that there had been at least 90. But I didn't bother. If they said 37, it was better than none. And I didn't want to pursue it by debating figures. And what was important to me was that at least there was a recognition that there was a serious number of civilians that had been killed. And I hope that that would then bring the ISAF force to look more carefully into the civilian casualties issues. This has, of course, become an issue that still lasts, not only in terms of casualties of Afghans killed, but what I will say as a result of less spectacular events. So often I experienced Afghans coming to me and telling me stories about this. And let me just mention one. One day we were in Kandahar, and an elderly Afghan comes to me and said, you know, last week my son was wounded by a flare from a military base. The flare was shot up to be able to see the surrounding area of the base, and it landed on the back of the young man and damaged him seriously. And this old man, then he went to the headquarters of the base and wanted to talk to somebody responsible and to explain what had happened. He went up one day, standing there the entire day. Nobody came out. He went back to his home. Then the next day he did the same. Spent the entire day there before he had to go home without being able to talk to anybody. And we should remember what these kind of incidents do. They shape the image of international forces. It's not only the spectacular incidents when 90 are killed or 64 are killed, but these kind of low-level incidents, so to speak, shape the perception of the people. And we must be careful. One day, we were driving with an Afghan driver through Kabul, and he stops to see an American convoy pass, military convoy, and he says, the Americans have taken over our capital, Kabul. It was absolutely untrue. There were almost no US military forces in Kabul at the time, but it was the perception. And that perception is terribly difficult to change, and we suffer from it still. When General McChrystal came in, summer 2009, he wrote in a strategic assessment that there is a crisis of confidence, and he was absolutely right. And we have not been able to repair it. This is not only the people on the ground who experience it that has problems from this. It's not least the president himself. The president himself. And I've seen so many times how he feels humiliated as a result of these civilian casualties and these incidents. Because for him, it is Afghan civilians and innocents killed, yes, but it is also a demonstration to his people that he cannot control the guests. He cannot control the guests, and he's not in charge of the country. And it infuriates him, and it humiliates him. But we've often seen reactions from Karzai that seem to be completely without any logic. And we are astonished, and we say, how is this possible? One day, he said, if you behave like this, I will join the Taliban. And we were all shocked, and we thought, how is this possible? How can the president say such a thing? Well, I think I would try to interpret him. What is he trying to say? In my mind, he is trying to say, if you continue behaving like this, you will also turn me into your enemy. And it makes sense. It makes sense. And it forms part, and here I go to a different topic, it forms part of a much wider complex of issues, such as, for instance, why did we not bother to consult the Afghans when we formulated our strategy? Why not? They own the country. They know the country. Why is it so that during a visit of Afghan ministers to Washington in February 2009, one of the most prominent ministers sent me an SMS text message with one word, neocolonialism. One word. Why is it? One of the most pro-European and pro-American ministers in the government, so frustrated of not being really consulted, not really be brought on board. And when, in March 2009, Hillary Clinton, whom I respect very much, had a press conference in Brussels and said there will be a conference on Afghanistan in The Hague on the 30th of March, and Mr. Eide will chair it, and Ban Ki-moon will be there. And I got the first press releases in on my computer, and I thought, oh, that's nice. And I thought I would call Minister Spanta, the foreign minister, and say to him, why didn't you tell me before? I mean, I should have known this. I'm going to chair this conference. So I called him and said, conference in The Hague? Nobody told us about the conference. Wait a minute, I'm going to check with the president. So we called the president, and 5 minutes later he called me back and he says, the president didn't know about this. Is it the way to treat a sovereign state? I don't think so. And I can mention one example after the other, such as the interference in elections. The interference in elections. When Richard Holbrooke, and I have to, in spite of the fact that he's no longer among us, I have to address this issue. When he first made his visit to Afghanistan, after the Obama administration had taken charge, what does he do? He goes to one minister after the other, one politician after the other, and then encourages them to stand against President Karzai in the presidential election. And of course, it created immediately a deep suspicion between Karzai and the Obama administration, because Karzai, as many Europeans also, cannot understand that this is what one man thinks and not the entire US administration. They can't distinguish. And it created, together with some other incidents that happened at the same time, a profound, unfortunately, profound mistrust between Karzai and in particular the US. And it was so sad because we all had such high hopes when that administration came in. I remember I was in something called Turquoise Mountains in Afghanistan, where Rory Stewart, a British politician, has gathered handicraftsmen and young people that he tries to teach old Afghan handicraft. And I was there and I met the Afghan vice president, Ahmad Zia Masood. And I hadn't seen him for a while, so I asked him, Mr. Vice President, how are you doing? And he said, I feel rather lonely, in fact. So why do you feel lonely? Because I must be the only prominent politician that Mr. Holbrooke has not asked to run for the presidency. That was the atmosphere at the time. That was the atmosphere at the time. And then we have the unfair criticism that the Afghans and the government has heard, such as, for instance, there's bad governance. Yes, there's bad governance. There's unqualified governance. But did we do anything to build the civilian institution from the outset? As Jim Dobbins, in fact, urged the Bush administration to do? No, we did not. We criticize the president and the government for allowing the warlords and power brokers to stay there, and for a culture of impunity. But in fact, those are the warlords and power brokers that we, the international community, brought back into power. And we have financed them with contracts, etc. And we have paid our respect to them. We've courted them. How can we criticize anybody else? When the question came up of arresting Dostum, one of the main warlords, 2 NATO countries said, please, Mr. President, don't do it. Don't do it, because it will bring instability in our area. How can we then criticize, therefore, there being a culture of an atmosphere of impunity? We have to follow the same standards ourselves that we expect our local interlocutors to follow. I'm sorry to raise so many depressing aspects of the situation. Do I then see no way forward? I think there is only one way forward, hard as it is, and that is a political solution where you have to involve the insurgents in talks, hopefully also dialogue, perhaps negotiations. There is simply no other way. And we at the UN, I must say, and myself, already from the outset, April, May 2008, argued for that kind of process, not only with what the US administration and most European then could accept perhaps, others could not, but some could accept talking to the non-ideological Taliban, as I said, well, whoever that may be. I haven't met them. We argued for discussing with the leadership. And we said in the Security Council and elsewhere, if you want relevant results, you have to speak to relevant people. It's very simple. If you want important results, you have to speak to important people, not to the less important people. And gradually, I'm glad to say, that has also been accepted by the wider international community and seems today also to be the US policy. The only thing I'm afraid of is that the international community is saying, we're on our way out, so we need to talk. That's not a good starting point for a negotiation that can lead to a solid and durable result. If we want solid results, we also have to demonstrate the patience that is required to get there. Do we have that patience? I hope. At the moment, I doubt it. But I hope that as we proceed, it will be understood by others also that that patience is necessary. But it's not only a question of talking to the Taliban. There has to be a national consensus inside of Afghanistan, and today that does not exist. Does not exist. The opposition against Karzai and his peace policy is significant, particularly in the other ethnic groups, but also, I must say, inside his own government. We have to, I think, from the international community, not only focus on Karzai, we have to focus on the Tajiks, on the Uzbeks, on the Hazaras, those who are against the kind of peace policy that we believe is right, and bring them into a national consensus around that policy. Today, that does not exist, I am afraid. And then, of course, the difficult burden of bringing the region into peace policy. In 2001, I think there was a useful participation of the countries in the region at the Bonn conference, and not least the Iranians played a solid and constructive role at that time. And there has to be a similar participation today from the Pakistani side. The Pakistanis have legitimate interest. They could stop talks with the Taliban, and they can start talks with the Taliban. And they have to do so, but they will only do so if they feel that their legitimate interests have been taken into consideration. On the other side, you have the Iranians, who can also be helpful, I believe, in bringing the other ethnic groups along. But we are today, unfortunately, in a situation where the relationship between Pakistan and Iran and the United States and the wider international community today is at a low point. We need them also more than ever. So I do think that there is a possibility. And I do not think that that possibility lies in continued military offensives, but in a peace policy. How do you establish, how do you get into that peace policy? How can you verify if all sides are serious? We tried already during my time a set of confidence-building measures vis-à-vis the Taliban. We tried to promote the delisting of detainees, or not detainees, delisting of people who were on the so-called 1267 list here at the UN. And we started to succeed from early 2010, was it late 2009, early 2010, and Ambassador Tanin raised that also in the Security Council at the time. And we tried also some other issues on the humanitarian side, such as having the Taliban give us access for vaccination campaigns and so on. But we have to move beyond that. I seriously believe, and we've argued this for 2 years now, seriously believe that both sides have to tell each other, we are ready to put talking before fighting. We are ready to de-escalate. And to demonstrate that, we will try to establish ceasefire zones of a specific area, of a specific time, to test each other's readiness. Maybe it works, maybe it does not. But that would at least be a serious test on the readiness of both sides. So I think that confidence-building process will be tremendously important and should be launched as soon as possible. And then if we get through the next 2 years, if we manage to get into talks and can have talks that enable us to maintain what has been achieved in Afghanistan, not least through the Constitution, which gives women and girls equal rights, if we can do that, then I think the future of Afghanistan looks brighter than many think. One, Afghanistan has tremendous natural resources, tremendous natural resources. Two, it has, in my view, a generation of younger and better educated people who want a different kind of political system and who want to have their say. And third, and very important, there is a media revolution in the country and has been over the last few years. And it's a media revolution that will play a more important role in the modernization of Afghanistan than I believe any other element. As the fiber optic cables are being extended across the country, so will also the impulses from abroad be strengthened and help the modernization of the country. And I think here not only are impulses from the West, but I think perhaps even more of impulses from more or less conservative Muslim countries that can create a debate about the role of Islam between Muslims and not between the West and Afghanistan. So in the longer term, as I say, if we can get through the next couple of years, I'm fairly optimistic. But there is a big but. I think we all have to be willing to engage, in a realistic policy of dialogue in order to bring the peace that is required to utilize those resources that are there. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Kai, for this really wonderful, comprehensive presentation. We have heard the guest. We want to hear the host.
Thanks, Jean-Marie. And I'm honored to be here with you, Jean-Marie, and with Kai, two distinguished colleagues and friends that with whom I share a history of great efforts for building a better Afghanistan in two different times. With Kai from 2008 to 2010, and with Jean-Marie who was Under Secretary General for Peacekeeping Operation, who played a vital role in shaping the UNAMA, and under his leadership we formed this new UN activities in Afghanistan, for which we are very thankful. I would like also to thank my good friend Scott Smith, who are now fortunate, you are now fortunate to have him here. And Scott spent an important part of his life in Afghanistan and for Afghanistan, including many years as DPQ's political officer. He also contributed to this debate through his book that we need to discuss it maybe another day under your stewardship here. What has brought us here is Kai's book, and it's Power Struggle over Afghanistan, as the title is. I think this is a subject that could also be used to define the history of the last 3 decades, at least. While much remains to be debated about the subject, I think the Kai book is offering, most importantly, a striking insight into what happened in the last 3 years. When I was listening to him now, I said, what a presentation. And I'm in no position to develop his stories. He's coming from inside that bitter feelings. And I'm not here today to add to his perspective, or to add to his story. He is an original storyteller here. He was there. He was inside that event, and he played his important role in a very critical time in shaping the history of my country. Let me come from a different door, and as a background, I would like to see where the UN is and where its envoys can be or have been. The UN has long been involved in Afghanistan from 1950s to 70s as an agent of developing and humanitarian assistance. But UN political role in Afghanistan started after the Soviet occupation in 1982. And since that time, we can remember exactly, I think, dozen of envoys in different names, and but we call them, we recognize them as a special representative of the Secretary General in the last 10 years. I think the first envoy for Afghanistan was Diego Cordoves, when Secretary General particular after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan tried to initiate a process that not only to lead to end of the occupation of Afghanistan by the Soviet forces, but to achieve peace in a peaceful Afghanistan, or to achieve a stable Afghanistan. Nobody except Diego Cordoves and Kai Eide wrote anything about their role in Afghanistan. Diego Cordoves wrote a book with famous scholar Slick Harrison, or maybe journalist and scholar. You know him better. And it's an account about the Geneva Accords between Afghanistan and Pakistan. It's a very UN diplomatic, different account, maybe less controversial. But Kai, I think, took a step that is very important. He is inviting us into knowing something we should wait to understand for long, long time. in 2001, soon after the US-led military intervention in Afghanistan and the breaking of the Taliban control in the country, the United Nations became central for hammering out a new internal arrangement which essentially informed the Bonn process. In December 2001, Mr. Lakhdar Brahimi, the UN envoy for Afghanistan, effectively managed to secure collaboration between Afghan functions around a 5-year roadmap for stability after 2 long decades. It was a great success for the UN. It was a great success for the international community. One should remember that the previous attempts before 2011 all failed in Afghanistan for search of a political solution. Once I said that Afghanistan has been a graveyard of the political solutions. And it was a time when Jean-Marie was part of a group trying to see how we can initiate a new process of reconciliation that was the last part of Kai's focus tonight. But UN started a very different work in Afghanistan with 2011, and its success partly stemmed from the fact that, and related to the fact that all main international and regional players at the time wanted the UN to pick up the pieces and help to forge a solution. UNAMA, in fact, in the last 10 years played an enormous role in Afghanistan. In the first half of the last decade, it practically filled a vacuum created by the steady disintegration of state after all these decades of crisis and conflict. From 2001, the UNAMA worked not only on behalf of the international community to support the Afghan government, but in fact it worked on behalf of the Afghan government, on behalf of a state that it sanctioned to support it. There was no decision at this first 5 years. It was when I think you were there, that the Afghan that there was no decision of the Afghan government that Mr. Brahimi was not part of it. In fact, UN was in the center. UN was not only there to support, because a disintegrated state was not able to function. I think Brahimi started his work with President Karzai and ended his work every day with President Karzai. And there was another one also, maybe the American Ambassador Khalilzad for some time. So we were in a very, difficult situation. And in such a situation, the UN role was not only enormous, but vital, important, and essential for the country. Over time, it has changed. The situation also evolved, and a multitude of international and national actors entered the scene. And that put all post-Brahimi SRSGs, including Kai, in each step, in every moment, as we listened, in a more delicate position of balancing numerous and often contradictory interests and views of both internal and international actors. Moreover, in my personal view, the United Nations faced in Afghanistan at least 4 paradoxes that added to the complexity of the role of UNAMA and the SRSG, or the Special Representative of the Secretary General in the country. First, the objective of a democratic peace building, paradox 1. The objective of a democratic peace building versus the aims and consequences of war and terror, and later NATO-led stabilization efforts. Paradox 2 is the perception of UNAMA as a leading international force versus the view that powerful international actors were and are laying down the rule of the game. Third, the paradox 3 is, or has been, that the support role of UNAMA versus its real managing role in the country. And the paradox 4, its commitment to democratic noble ideas, inspiring millions of Afghans by offering a different future versus the pragmatic recognition of power politics, including through putting justice on hold for the sake of peace. From almost end of 2006, we face also with a deteriorating security situation in the south, a Taliban comeback with the extensive trans-border support from Pakistan, began to pose serious challenges to the efforts of the international and national actors, and gradually triggered not only the beginning of a blame game, but undertaking new thinking in all fronts. It included a redefined status for the UN and the special representative of the Secretary General. Before the end of work of or tenure of Tom Kunig's, Kai's predecessor in 2007, December 2007, the institutional memory of do the UN memory is short, but ours shouldn't be. I think at that time, at the end of his tenure, a new paradigm emerged among some international players, emphasizing a strong role for the SRSG, inspired by a heavy-handed experiences of some international envoys during the Balkan Wars of 1990s. Paddy Ashdown, a British politician, the former leader of the Labour Party, the Liberal Democrat Party, Lib Dems, they call it, and a former old hand in Balkans, was seen as a potential perfect international strongman for such a position in Kabul. The search for a Herculean role was justified, as we know, by the need for compensating a perceived weak government in Kabul, and sometimes they added incompetent government in Kabul, and to restore an orderly action of the international players. In Kabul, people slowly had started to see the suggestion as the coming of a new colonial viceroy. The word viceroy is known there. because the British political in British India, the leaders, the civilian leaders of the British power was known as viceroys. So President Karzai I think, initially was in favor of a commonly accepted figure for the international community, a commonly accepted figure for all as an SRSG. And even he met him, he received him in Dubai or during one of his trips, rejected the suggestion. And there are more stories there, but to make it shorter, the Secretary General Ban Ki-moon then decided promptly to look into other names on the short list. Kai is detailing that in his book. And at the end, as we know, Kai was appointed as a new SRSG for Afghanistan. I was the first Afghan authority at that time, and that was regularly advised and informed in all steps of decision by the SG. And the response I received immediately after the appointment of Kai, after informing Kabul about this decision, was a very welcoming one. So our government in Afghanistan was supportive of such prompt decision. Rejection of Mr. Ashton created a diplomatic inconvenience around, but there was a president no that was involved, and also there was a feeling that Kai is also another old hand of Balkan, and there was an expectation that he's going to do what Paddy Ashton can do. Even in his book and the meeting with President Bush, it's emphasized that there's a strong man to go to Kabul or something similar to that, right? But it was not the same strong man that under UN leadership, Jean-Marie, the UN was looking for. Or at that time, I don't know. You were there?
Yes.
So I met Kai in the UN old building, now under repair. And after his appointment, Scott Smith and Tom Craig, two of his colleagues, was with him. And I think I was candid with my advice to him. I saw the other day my notes. I told him it's essential to understand the government of Afghanistan and work with it. It's important to balance relationship with all actors, and it is necessary to bring orders to the UN house. Perhaps he remembered my advice or not, but he got the similar advices from others in Kabul. I think it was the beginning of a partnership between both of us that lasted for until the end of his tenure, and I'm very happy to be here near to him and share this today's talking with him. And then this partnership always reinforced the messages we shared in the Security Council debates on Afghanistan and our talks in New York. Kai, as I promised, I'm not adding to his account. I'm not using his account in favor of my feelings as an Afghan envoy when I should share some of the frustrations that Afghan leadership still have about the way the international partners would work with our government. But I would like just to mention a few points when I had a reading of his book, and it's interesting. Not you can, when you read it, you would like to read it again because you think that there are issues that you need to check again. So I would like to congratulate you for that success. Kai arrived in Afghanistan during a very difficult time. He just told us that where the international community was, where the thinking were going, and where the problems laid. At least the insecurity at that time and the violence has spread to many parts of the country. The Taliban insurgency became a serious threat in many parts, or at least in south and southeast. People who supported the government and the international community came increasingly under attack. Civilian casualties rose, and the difference in approach of the Afghan government and the international community put us at odds in more and more. And the negative trends further developed as the country was moving towards the second presidential election in 2009. Kai also talked about the absence of a strategy that should bring us together, and the confusing relation between different actors, the misunderstanding that still continues to affect our good efforts. Today I was just reading Ambassador Crocker statement was given today in Kabul, and he's still talking that the press is misinterpreting our intentions. Let me quote, read some of the quotes. He said, simply put, the United States committed to supporting the efforts of the central government to build a strong, secure, democratic, and unified Afghanistan. We have no other aim or goal. Rumors that the United States has a plan to divide Afghanistan or change its form of government, or frankly speaking, lies that dishonor and the sacrifice of more than 1,800 American service members who have died in the cause of a unified Afghanistan governed by its constitution. He's also touching what Kai just touched, that let me also address another false and absurd rumor. The United States is seeking a secret deal with the Taliban at the expense of the Afghan government and people. As you know, Ambassador Grossman was just in Kabul. During his visit, we engaged in a comprehensive discussion on the way forward with President Karzai, his senior advisors, and with the leadership of the High Council. I think he is trying to deal with these perceptions, but it speaks volume about misunderstanding. And this is what, in 2008 to 2010, Kai faced in Afghanistan. We failed in getting out our messages, and we failed for a long time to understand each other's. So in such a time, he arrived in Kabul. His successors faced some of the problems that he faced at that time, diplomats, including the American ambassador. And then I think when Kai came to Afghanistan, we shouldn't forget that, and he's very elaborated about this in his book, that Afghanistan's main international supporter, the United States, was in an election year, and you know much better than the naive diplomats like us what the election year means here, and the democratic leadership was waiting in the wings, and now we learn later with a different view about the world. As Kai detailed in his book, I think he felt more and more, and as he just shared with us his feelings, the burden of an accumulating complexity on his shoulders. And as Jean-Marie said at the beginning, it's one of the very difficult jobs, possibly impossible jobs, because you are asked or mandated to balance all these contradictory interests. In Afghanistan, we have more than 40 military players. We have 62 donors, 20 international organizations dealing with some 40 Afghan institutions. And it is, you can imagine that in an absence of coordination, and this coordination should be done by the government rather than the international community. And when the UN is asked to do that, how it is difficult to do these coordinations in all political, civilian, military, and economic and other areas. But I think I would like to be very candid and open that Kai provides us with a unique, honest witness account as the main international figure of the time in Afghanistan about the increasing threatening threats, trends, the troubling lack of understanding, as I said, and misunderstanding between the Afghan government, the international partners, and also the absence or the lack of real understanding of the local particularities by the international players, an increased civilian death, and its impacts on the perception of Afghan people. We are, as representative of Afghanistan, careful to talk about civilian deaths. Last night I was in a reception that was organized for the second term of the Security General that just started. And then one of the Latin Americans ambassadors who's happened to be very sympathetic to the to our cause, and he's not one of those that are critical of the United States policies. Just came, and this ambassador is not he, is the woman, said that I just wanted to, Ambassador, I haven't seen you for some time, but I would like to express my my condolences for what happened to some people there. And I waited a little bit to know what she means, because many things are happening every day. He said, I mean this, and she was trying to find the word, this urinating on the deaths, right? And I didn't know what to say. And I just waited. Yes, I said yes, it was bad. Yeah, and then you can, I said we are careful, not these issues to cloud our relations, to affect it, because the interest of the United States in Afghanistan, the international community in Afghanistan is big. And as Ambassador Crocker just in his statement said, there are people who sacrificed their life and treasures, blood, and waste are there for making this story a successful one. But what Kai is talking about, and what is important to know, is that the Afghan people who welcomed the intervention of the NATO forces of the United States in Afghanistan as an important act to remove the Taliban, to end that brutal period of the history, they would like to see that the international community, the United States, act as friends, not as an enemy or not as an occupying force. And this is what people like Kai, myself, or anyone else in the Afghan government or the international community are sensitively looking that such acts wouldn't cause harms to our cause. I think in this book, Kai is trying also to understand the reasons behind the growing frustrations among Afghans and about some troubling aspects of the activities of the international community, not just civilian deaths, but also other aspects. This is why Kai insisted in this book that the international community should respect, it's his words, the Afghan government, not to ignore the legitimate concerns of Afghans, and should not treat the country as no man's land. The book has a unique focus on the second election in Afghanistan, as he said that he left, the option for us to read it, and the book is more detailed on this issue. But I think what you get from this book is that it was an occasion where the strategies of the new U.S. administration and its ambitious spatial envoy, late Ambassador Richard Holbrooke, were tested. During this election, with the irregularities that were widely debated, the UN was pushed into a difficult situation when Kai's deputy, or the UN's number 2 guy in Afghanistan, an American diplomat, another old hand of Balkan wars, and an ally of Richard Holbrooke, publicly embarked on a crusade to enlist the White House in a plan to force the president of Afghanistan, Hamid Karzai, to resign. And this is what the UN officially said. What I was reading here was what Nambiar, Vijay Nambiar, told to the press at the time. The rest of the story is known for those who follow the situation in Afghanistan. But any true understanding of the debate about the elections and about what went wrong, with the all consequences for the prospect of stability and the relations of Afghanistan with its international partners, would be incomplete if Kai's book has not been read. In fact, Mr. Eide's book, Power Struggle Over Afghanistan, is a real guide for understanding many unspeaks. Today somebody knew that I'm coming here, another my colleague in the UN, and he learned about this book. And the first thing he said that diplomats are not writing the books, and such books. So he asked me why he wrote it. He wanted to respond unfair accusations against them, or he's really giving an account. And my answer was that whatever your understanding is, it is really a book that is speaking volumes about, and it speaks truth, and it's help us to understand the complexity of the situation when it is not too late. If you, the story is not a good guide. We know how the mistakes change the course of history. But if you know the mistakes when it happens, it may help you to choose the right course. So this is why I admire him for his courage, for his decision, and for his for his lack of fear of talking, of speaking the truth. There are one thing that my country, and as a representative of Afghanistan, should emphasize here about this book, that there are no better warnings that accounts in assessment that Kai offers us in this book, if we don't want to lose this struggle or the necessary support of the Afghan people. I think this book is going to be judged differently by different people. But when you read it, you know what happened, what went wrong, and where are this the perception, the perspective of all sides. We, from 2009 to 2000, I'm an American audience rather than an Afghan one. But from 2009 or just before that to 2010, when he was there and when elections were here, the media pundits and writers of some newspapers not far from us convinced us that Afghanistan is going in a wrong direction because it is led by corrupt people. And they tried to convince us that it was an illegitimate elections, it was fraudulent, and then they tried to justify an idea of leaving the country because we did everything, we brought democracy for them, we changed the things, we put money there, but these people are not ready to do what they should do. They walk in the Old Testament. They have no history, and they are corrupt. That was the wrong history. One need to read his book to see the issue are so complex. It's not about an international community that is wrong, or that is about an Afghan government that is not right. We all have our parts in mistakes, and if there is a future, it should be a future that we have to work together for. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I think we have a lot now on the table. I will just to get us started, I'll just ask two questions, one to Kai and one to Ambassador Tanin. Kai, I mean, a big part of your book focuses on the elections that the ambassador was just discussing, and I'm not going to ask you questions specifically on the Afghan elections, but you've seen elections in Bosnia, you have the experience of the Afghan elections. In all these processes after a conflict, elections are a big part of the post-conflict strategy, and they are fraught with enormous ambitions and enormous difficulties. And I think we would all be interested in hearing from you how, on the basis of that experience, you see the role of elections and how we should approach them.
Scott just wrote a book about this. He's probably better placed than me to answer. But I think we inherited from the 1990s a belief that we could fix states. And there's even a book written, How to Fix Failed State. And ironically, it's written by an Afghan. You don't fix states of that sort. I wouldn't call Afghanistan a failed state, but you don't fix states that are in that kind of situation. The nation-building project that we embarked on When we embark on that kind of project, we must understand that this is going to be an extremely time-consuming affair. Extremely time-consuming. And we do have the tendency to be ambitious in substance and impatient in time. And those two elements simply do not go together. And I think this is one of the issues we're suffering from today also. We are so impatient that we risk abandoning the project before it has been put on the right course, and solidly so. When it comes to the elections in Afghanistan, I think we tried to explain what is this about. Is it an election of the kind that we've seen in Western Europe or in the Balkans? No, it's not. It's an election in a country where close to 80% happen to be illiterate. When you go into a village where the elections will take place, you know that there may not even be one person who is able to read and write, who is able to look at and understand the 3.5-page ballot paper that none of us have ever been confronted with. None of us. And then voters coming to the polling center and is asked to tick off which candidate do I support. I haven't seen these candidates before. And I don't know what that pen is for. Never seen that pen. And then we criticize when there are same tick marks. We say, automatically there's fraud here. I mean, we have to be realistic. What is this all about? What is it about when we have to hire 3,000 donkeys to get election paper into remote villages? But then don't be overly ambitious with regard to what you're going to see. It's not going to be ideal. It's going to be far from ideal. And that's what the elections were. But I must say, I've tried to also detail this a little bit. There was a lot of irregularities and a lot of fraud, and nobody denied it, contrary to what my deputy said. But what we never wrote extensively about the media is the blatant international interference that also contributed to ruining the elections. And I think the expectations of the international community was much higher than the Afghans who actually live in Afghanistan. If you look at Afghanistan's elections compared to the elections in the neighboring countries, countries that are in many ways more advanced than Afghanistan, I say, you don't find in Afghanistan a ruler who receives 90% of the votes as you do in the Central Asian countries. You don't. You don't see in Afghanistan an election where the winning party receives 65% of the votes, and when there are demonstrations in the streets, they are brutally knocked down. You don't do that. There is a different kind of atmosphere around it. And I must say, I do still repeat that for the Afghans to carry out their elections under those kind of circumstances was an achievement. An achievement for those who did their best to organize them, an achievement for those who tried to protect the security of the election as much as possible, and certainly also for those who dared to go and vote under these kind of circumstances. I asked myself, and I've written about this, I asked myself, was it too early? Should we have pulled the emergency brake a few months before the election and said, now this is not going to work. It's going to be much too messy, much too difficult. It won't have the credibility and legitimacy that's required. And I remember I went to the National Security Advisor, to the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and I said, look, we should be prepared to pull that emergency brake. And when I came to the National Security Advisor, he said, Kai, remember one thing. 5 years ago, we started a democratic process. There were elections. If you now pull the emergency brake before the second set of elections, you will kill the democratic process. It will not be the kind of election that you want, but you will kill the democratic process of this country. You can't do that. The only way to consolidate them is to carry on. and to understand that they will be far from perfect. And I think he was probably right. Had we done anything else, I think it would have been absolutely detrimental to Afghanistan's, to the building of Afghan democracy, and we certainly didn't want to do that.
Thank you. A question for you, Ambassador. You referred to the Bonn process and you referred to reconciliation. At Bonn, there were no Taliban. It would have been unthinkable. They had been routed. Today, the discussion is about how to engage the Taliban. There's an evolution of the American position. I think it's Kai who said that there's not a real consensus in Afghanistan on how to engage the Taliban. Certainly the views among the former members of the Northern Alliance, there's a range of views on what to do. How do you see that process evolving? What do you think is the right approach on a process like reconciliation today?
Thank you. If you allow me, I just add to the election issue three observations.
Please.
Before coming to this.
And I may, in return, add some observations to you.
You should.
I'll
Correct
negotiate
me,
that.
please. I think you have an insider view, and a little bit. If you're longer here, even if you represent the country, if you're longer out of the country, you become a little bit of outsider, with few steps far from New York Times. So. Three observations. One, Ashraf Ghani, one of the candidates of this presidential election, a rival to President Karzai, as Kai mentioned his name for his book, he told me later that what we got it wrong, and Holbrooke got it wrong, that we didn't know that this election was not, Afghanistan move at that time through that election was not about, in the view of people, not about establishing or strengthening the democracy. It was about stability, and we didn't get it right. That's one thing. I'm not going into details, but I think that's telling a lot. The second thing is, I think when there is no security or enough security, having an election is vulnerable. Whether it's Afghanistan or Ivory Coast or anywhere, you cannot have a fair election under the shadow of the gun and under the threat of being killed by the enemies. So NATO was responsible also for not making secure, but if it couldn't, the election should, in my personal view, should have been dealt differently. The third thing, election everywhere should be seen part of a bigger democratization effort rather than as the sole means and end of democracy in these post-conflict fragile countries. And irregularities is unavoidable if there is not enough security and if this new culture is not taking root. You have the Putin model now, for example, in a country that should be better, more democratic than Afghanistan. Or you have a law here now that if you cannot buy the votes, which is wrong, but you can disfigure your enemy with $5 or $10 million. Today, now, what's happening, and before this, Florida's primary, and you can also sell yourself as a very bitter man. So you can destroy your rival, and you can make yourself very different through the monies that business officially now by the law can put at your hands. I'm not saying that through that justifying what happened in Afghanistan, but we have to be careful with all these things. And then we come from a different culture, and a culture people don't think that Prophet Muhammad was elected, or Jesus here was elected. So the legitimacy may be not the same. So that's I put it here with the reconciliation. It's said, or saying is going on that in upheavals or in difficult situations, the analogy is flying like shrapnel. So the analogy is alive in the mind of Afghans when it comes to reconciliation. We failed in 1980s, we failed in 1990s, and then, and I didn't touch it here, why we failed. And I just said that Afghanistan was a graveyard of political solutions. Mm-hmm. Diego Cordoves just helped to sign, to help Afghanistan, Pakistan to sign an accord in Geneva. But what was the rest, the internal one? It was buried under the negative symmetry formula of the United States and the Soviet Union. Benin Siwan, who later was accused of being bribed by Saddam Hussein, and the UN report indicted him, and he had to be subject of criminal investigation, but he left in October 2005 the country, and he was given an amnesty by the former Secretary General. So in Afghanistan, that man who was the special envoy couldn't secure a deal between the Afghan leaders, which led not only to the fall of Najib, but later it led to the infightings in Kabul that resulted in killing of 50 to 60,000 people. Mm. I'm not accusing Benin Siwan, but I think all of us contributed to that catastrophic failure of a political solution that could help us to avoid such a catastrophic situation in Kabul. It was not only the killing of these people. 100,000 left the city. And the whole city, with all its history, is collapsed, is destroyed. And today, even today when Kai was here, the Darlamon Palace in better places all is still seen that is destroyed by that war. And one of the persons who is accused by all that was, and he was rocketing Kabul, Hikmat Yar, the other day when they were talking to the president, their representative with our president's office, and I read that in his 17-point suggestion, he also asked for dealing with war criminals. So there are that difficulties. But what I'm saying is there are analogies. The whole position at that time of the Mujahideen in relation with the Najib government in the 1990s was that this government should first resign, that foreign forces should go, then we discuss the composition of an interim government or a transition government, which can lead should lead to the elections. So the strategy of the Mujahideen at that time was to destroy what it is before making what you like to make. So what we should see, and what we should be aware, that how we deal with that reconciliation as the Afghan government, as its international partners, as the United States. as Kai said, we know the international community cannot stay there to save the Afghan government from its enemies or attacks forever. This war must be ended. We should turn that page. So what is the solution? The solution is outreach to all and reconciliation with the enemy. There is no doubt about that. It is also right that there is no consensus in Afghanistan, but there is consensus about the principle, but no consensus about the way you deal with it. I don't think there's anybody in Afghanistan to say that we don't want any reconciliation. Of course, there are people, they see the Taliban as criminals, as killers, and in any conflict, when you bring two sides that killed each other, the logic is going to be lost in the middle. But what I think that we have to be only careful how to deal with this issue. There are two more points I have to make. The international community established something together with Afghans that is there. It is a system. This is where we're based on elections, even with irregularities. There is an economy. There is a parliament. There is a civil society. There is education. There is an emphasizing framework for human and women's rights, fragile as it may be, but it's there. And there is also a government and the way to change it. Now, we want the Taliban and others to be included in that system, and also to give a chance to the international community to turn its presence in Afghanistan into a peaceful, constructive one. But the danger is that you can lose what you have before getting something you wish to have. So the tactic here is important. The talks in Qatar is peace. It is not yet talks. The contacts with Hekmatyar in Kabul and other groups are not yet talks. There is this bargaining that or from one side it's confidence building measures, from the other side it is a struggle for legitimization, and it is not the Taliban on the one side and Afghan government or others. It has its very complicated regional route, and you have the safe havens in the neighboring country Pakistan. It is an open secret. Everybody knows it. And with that, we are all involved. I know that the Commission, you worked under Ambassador Tom Pickering, with this Ambassador Brahimi. They came with a very comprehensive view about how move towards the reconciliation. But if we are not patient, and if we are not responsible about the future of the country and the region, then it's not reconciliation. It is we negotiate an exit. But if we don't negotiate an exit, then the strategic partnership document that to be signed between Afghanistan and the United States, reconciliation talks in Qatar, work with the region, including Pakistan, should be seen as one and should be managed as one. If you miss any pieces of that, then, of course, as Kai said, if the idea is to get out, of course you can get out without an agreement or with an agreement.
Yes, let's open it for question then. Please. Ambassador Saltzman.
I remember when the Soviet Union whose border was with Afghanistan, as Uzbekistan, with several 100,000 men in several years, did not defeat the Taliban. Before the Soviet Union went in there, As I recall, the Taliban were a radical Islamic country who were bothering nobody particularly except their own people. I was there on an airplane with the Soviet boys when I left Chimkent with several hundred of them, bedraggled and defeated, as our boys were when they left Vietnam. We were their allies. We were the allies of the Taliban. We gave them several thousand Stingers to put on their shoulders and shoot down airplanes. Why do we suddenly care about changing how they want to run their country, except for the occasional warlords in pockets here and there? How is it the interest of the United States to want to throw the Taliban out not so long ago, or our allies? I don't understand what our purpose is. Can you explain?
I don't sure if you understand the question. I think he wants to know why suddenly Afghanistan, we want to change the internal order of Afghanistan and we switch allies.
I think it's good to see how often we have switched allies, and how often we have regretted it. Now, why did we go after the Taliban after having been, you say, its allies, or at least equip them with Stinger and other kind of weaponry? But the obvious reason is, of course, 9/11. And the fact that we all knew that there would be some kind of response from the United States. Now, what I think was dramatically wrong, and here I think I follow your point, is that just after 9/11, when the response came, because it's not only the US but the international community, saw Taliban and Al-Qaeda as one. As one. Was it in reality? I don't think so. I don't think so. They are different in so many ways, but we failed to recognize, because the Bush doctrine at the time said, you're with us or you're against us. There was no room for anything else. And so we missed the critical difference between the two, which is Al-Qaeda is a global terrorist network. The Taliban is an Afghan, only Afghan insurgency movement. And it took the Bush doctrine to bring them together in a way, which was absolutely dramatic at the time. And particularly since there was also, at that critical juncture, approaches made by some very senior Taliban to be able to play a part at the Bonn conference, but it was rejected. So I think at that early stage, in the aftermath of a very dramatic event, which was the 9/11 attacks, that the atmosphere was perhaps not such that it was possible to distinguish between two very different forces. I think we're paying for that today.
Yes, can you go to the microphone, the soon-to-be microphone, and identify yourself? Maybe we'll collect a couple of questions.
Hi, thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Pushkar Sharma. I'm a first-year student here at CIPA. My question is about the recent Brahimi Pickering report. And a lot of the focus and attention of the report is around negotiations that it suggests with the Taliban, but also a significant part of the report focuses on implementing reforms to the Afghan state to build a more effective, robust state. Do you believe that these reforms are needed? And what are the most important reforms that should be put in place?
Ambassador Tanin, do you want to answer?
I think you wanted Kai to say that to speak.
Well, let me first say that I believe that the report is very good in many ways. First of all, I think it's important that it suggests to have one channel, as one international channel beside the Afghan government to conduct a dialogue with the Taliban. You know, I was in a little bit north of here in April, in Boston. I was sitting down with another expert. I mean, we have some here. I'm not, but there was another expert on Afghanistan. And we sat down to count how many channels we knew about, how many would-be peacemakers. And we came up, I think, with 10 or 11 countries and organizations that were all running after the Taliban to negotiate. It can't work like that. And not only that, but they're all keeping their information to themselves. They don't even want to tell the Afghan government. How can you have a peace process like that? It's completely ridiculous. And that's why I think, first of all, there has to be one international channel to help facilitate the talks, and the Afghans have to be in charge. Yes, the United States and Taliban may discuss withdrawal of troops, release of detainees, etc. But when it comes to Afghanistan's internal order, that cannot be discussed by the United States and the Taliban. It has to be discussed by the Afghan government. You know, you mentioned, I think, or referred to indirectly at least, efforts or discussions about decentralization, division, and so on. And there was one meeting, I think, recently in Berlin.
Yeah.
Berlin or Bonn, with some US congresswoman who had met with prominent Afghan politicians to discuss decentralization of Afghanistan. Is it her business? Not at all. It's not our business. It's the business of the Afghans. And we should stay away from that kind of thing because it's dangerous. We don't know anything about it. Now, your question was, another was reforms needed. Yeah, I think there are two issues that drive the Taliban today more than any other. Yes, of course, it's a very radical movement, and religions also drive. But I think there are two elements that really are tremendously important, become more important over the later years. One is the sense that the international community has invaded Afghanistan not only with forces, but in terms of values, religion, culture. It's very important. But the other is, it feels that there is a government that does not respond to their needs. And therefore, if there's one element that I believe is important, and it is to create government institutions, civilian institutions, that work, that are not corrupt, or less corrupt than they are today. And so I think government reform is tremendously important. And I think that is also mentioned in your report.
Yes. I can just add, because I mean, if the reconciliation is 50% of the pacification, establishing and strengthening a government that's competent and clean is the other 50%. Because the trust of people is important. The Taliban is not a popular movement, but they can benefit from the lack of efficiency or the uncleanness of the government, whether it's my government or it is any government there.
Hi, I'm Manav Sachdeva. I'm a professor here at CIPA. I have a couple of questions. One, I feel we have, in your talks, Kai, it's more directed at you, you've perhaps not touched at all on what a Pakistani critic actually recently mentioned was Saudi imperialism. For a long, long time, the Saudis have basically spent the money to replace the public education sector in Pakistan for the last 30 years, which led to the creation of this Wahhabi thought process, which is the process that is in basically the Taliban process. So in essence, as you know, in Kosovo, they tried to come. I was also in Kosovo, also in Afghanistan. It was thrown out. The Wahhabis were thrown out, and thank God for that. So perhaps if one is to think deeply about where to address, one has to also think about the pipe of where the money comes for education. You also perhaps maybe need to, if you could, address the Durand line. The aspect of looking at the Taliban is a murky one when you don't perhaps think that at this point the Pashtun identity with the kind of civilian killings that have happened it's a very, with the need to respect honor, it's getting very difficult to really say this is the Talib and this is the Taliban movement and this is where you're addressing. So to look at it as a singular force is at this stage perhaps very different than what it was 10 years ago. And lastly, it's a critique of you, really, if you would kindly address it, because as US presidents mentioned that you come into government with an extremely idealistic agenda, but you're basically putting out fires. It sounds like when you came in as an SRSG, you had this great vision, but you describe in the way you do that there's an agenda setting from the outside that was imposed first elections, then the militarization of the agenda. How realistic, if you were, quote unquote, one of the most powerful persons, if not the most powerful person in Afghanistan for 2 years, and yet you seem to be facing pressures from outside rather than setting the agenda. I sort of fear the impact others can have. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe we'll get the other two questions and then, please.
Thank you. My name is Rob Weil. I'm a Columbia alum. I was hoping if you could offer just, I guess, a brief vision of what you expect the situation will look like once the United States does withdraw in terms of various foreign players' influence in the country. Thank you.
Could you I didn't, what's your question?
Could you articulate briefly how you envision what the foreign influence will be in the country once the U.S. withdraws?
Hi, I'm Jenna Graydon. I teach here at Columbia at CICR, and also I actually represent your government, the Ministry of Mines. My question really is to both of you. A significant portion of the economy of Afghanistan now is foreign aid, directly or indirectly. It can be given through the government, any sources, NGOs, etc. Long-term stability clearly needs political agreement, but it also needs sustainability. The only thing that's sustainable is economics. Security is one aspect. Obviously, you can't do work if you have no security. What is the future of Afghanistan in becoming economically self-sustainable, whether agriculture, mining, or anything else, and how do you get there?
Okay. A few simple questions. So, you want to start?
But the good thing is that when you have so many questions, you could choose. And you can put aside those you don't want to answer. So how many are left? One? I think on the last one, I would rather like to start looking a little bit back in time. Where are you? With the last question.
Yeah, the last
There
question.
you are. There you are. You're moving around. I can't focus on it. Moving target. But I think we have several lost years here. It's easy to say that now because you asked how do we move forward. But the fact that we did not immediately focus much more money on larger infrastructure projects that would in fact enable us to, or enable the Afghans to extract their minerals and their resources, link up to the coasts on each side to Central Asia, which is not, is a big infrastructure project, but it's not undoable, you know? It's not undoable. It's still not undoable to do parts of this in the most stable parts of the country. And we should, but it seems that the donors don't dare to touch these kind of things. First of all, they run over many years, and they like to have their annual budget approach, you know? Ambassadors want to be able to cut ribbons every third month. So all the attention is drawn away from these longer-term approaches that you need to have. So that, I believe, was one of the main problems that we had before I arrived, and certainly also when I was there. Although a couple of important infrastructure projects were completed, such as the power line between Uzbekistan and down to Kabul. I think it's going to take quite some time before you can see the resources in the central northern parts of Afghanistan being exploited. Not only because it's hard to develop the infrastructure, it takes years, but I mean, investors will be frightened away as long as you have the instability you have today. Hopefully that will not last long, and if it comes to an end, I think the investors will come in fairly soon to start working on the infrastructure that's required. What I only hope is that we won't have profit-greedy companies and corrupt Afghan officials combined in an effort to extract these resources in a way that's certainly not in the interest of the Afghan people. They need this. Why did I not, as the most powerful person in Afghanistan, succeed? Oh, I wish I were. I wish I were. It's not like that. You know? First of all, it is certainly against my basic thinking about how Afghanistan should develop. The Afghans had to be in charge. I think this was the flaw, I think, of the Paddy Ashdown thing. And Paddy Ashdown is a very, very competent and experienced person, but this viceroy model that was there was flawed because, again, we were putting the international community to be in charge. While what you needed was the sooner you could bring the Afghans to the table and have them take responsibility, the better would it be. Because we didn't know. When would we turn our back to Afghanistan? Would it be next year, the year after? When would we have another crisis that would absorb our energy and financial resources? Could happen any moment. Could happen any moment. And for every day that went without us giving the Afghans the responsibility, the more danger would we be in of not having a development strategy that was really sustainable. But I also think, you know, an Afghan president, he has to talk to the ISAF commander. And he talked to McChrystal more than anybody else, because he liked McChrystal, as I did. The others he didn't like so much. But he has to talk to the ISAF commander. He has to talk to the American ambassador, but doesn't have to talk to the UN representative. Not at all. He can ignore him, as he has done also in the past, or he can talk to him. He will talk to him if he sees him as being useful. And in order to be useful, you also have to be able to criticize the other international players. And you have to be seen as being a team. I was criticized being too close to Karzai. If I had decided, as some others decided, or had it decided for them, not to be so close, you can become irrelevant. And I think it was right of me to be close to him. I was not the most powerful person in Afghanistan, but I think at times I was the most influential international representative, because I could sit down with President Karzai alone, day after day, to talk about the composition of his government. He didn't discuss that with many other people. About his selection of vice presidential candidates, etc., etc. But we had that kind of dialogue. In that way, I think that for a long period of time, I was the most influential in terms of interlocutor. But I didn't have any money. I didn't have any military forces. So it was only by being seen by him as being useful that you can have power or influence. And once you are seen by the international community of being close to the president, of being able to influence the president, then they also start seeing you as useful. It's only useful, not powerful, I'm afraid. Your two other questions, I would like to start replying tomorrow at 8 o'clock, if you will be here, because I think time is really running out.
Yes.
And that's an excuse for not answering questions that were much too sophisticated and complicated for me to be able to reply to.
Do you want to add a word?
I agree with Kai. The last question is, in a way, an answer also. I mean, it is a statement that how you can have a long-term stability when the economy is mainly based on foreign aid without a political consensus or structure and a sustainability that should come from economy. This is the question, and it's the answer also. After 10 years, Afghanistan is not where it should have a prospect of a sustainable economy and a sustainable political agreement. And this is what we work for. The question is why we couldn't reach to that point earlier. Why our efforts in the last 10 years didn't take us where we should have a reliable, we should have a process of transition that can be reliable and take us to the transformation of the country as we know. So, and this issue is related with another question was if the Americans are going to leave now or the US is going to leave now, what happens? It's also an answer. So I think after 10 years, the prospect of transition and the prospect of winning Afghanistan and the prospect of creating a stable Afghanistan is deeply linked, organically linked with the partnership of the Afghan government, the Afghan people, with the international community for years to come. Of course, the nature of that partnership should change. The transition should be from war to peace. The transition should be from towards an Afghan-led Afghan leadership. But I think if the assumption is that Afghans should do it now, I don't think the Afghans has the means to do it now alone. The other question is that I also would like to attribute to the idea of the UN powerful man. We ask the United Nations to look into the mandate of UNAMA. At the end of the day, in any post-conflict situation, the aim should be to put the national government in the center. Without the central government to coordinate the national and international efforts, you cannot have a long-term stability that you need. Afghanistan is part of a fragile piece of the world, the post-conflict countries that represent at least some 1.5 billion people, a quarter of humanity. And the story is about conflict, post-conflict, recurrence of conflict, vulnerable to conflict, coming back of the conflicts, and sliding back into the conflicts. Whether it's Chad or Congo, it's Afghanistan or Timor-Leste, Somalia or another. They don't have the same fate. They don't get the same attention, but they are in different parts of the world. But this is where the Millennium Goals are not going to be achieved. This is where the people are suffered. This is where the military intervention and expediencies left them in a kind of perpetual absence of future. Afghanistan shouldn't be in such a thing, and it's the UN, I think, responsibility not to be another UN Congo, but a UN to enable Afghanistan to take responsibility. That is what we want. And also how to translate these big international gatherings. Bonn was unprecedentedly the representation of 90 countries and international organizations about Afghanistan, or hundreds. Yeah? But it was an emotional gathering. Now we look how to fiscally guarantee or feed the promises that are made in the next Tokyo conference. I think everybody's looking at me when he's going to finish. I feel not good. So when it on this Saudi Arabia and Iran, as you said, these are big issues. But I think there is not going to be any peace in Afghanistan if Pakistan is not addressed. And then there is no stability in the region if the madrasas are not addressed. The Salafis had no role in Egypt revolution, but they are now there with 25% of the vote. The Islamic world, generally in my personal view, is facing with a danger within, that is the extremism that is threatening it for long time. It has been a generational threat after the war of Afghanistan. It's going to be another generational threat if there is not a collaboration between the international community and the national governments to look into the root cause of the issues and address it. Of course, power politics may create a convenience of working with any group that can help you. And that conference in Berlin, which caused a lot of anger in Kabul, it is not Rohrabacher that met that people. But the presence of other people there was something that caused concerns. Like the CEO of the Blackwater company, for the number 2 of Sanitas big security company. No? Charles Santos who used to work for Delta Oil, and it's northern Afghanistan, and there is this mine thinking, and then you hear about federalism, and then you have Richard Wheeler, who in 2010 said that let's break Afghanistan and give it pieces to Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Pakistan, and others. So these are the things that create fear, and these are the things we have to address it together if we want a real stability together. When it comes to Saudi Arabia and others, in Islamic world, these countries, or whatever policies they have, we need to work with it. Saudi is a religious authority. So this is why we have to work with them, and we have to engage them. And this is why we are lucky to have this Istanbul process where Saudi Arabia is part of it.
Thank you very much. I think we can give a hand to all that.